I'd been working the late shift at the downtown library for almost 3 years. My commute home was always the same: catch the 12:30 a.m. express bus, which would whisk me across town in about 40 minutes. It was usually a quiet ride. By that hour, most people were either asleep or long gone from the city center. The bus itself was old, a familiar rumbling behemoth with faded blue seats and fluorescent lights that buzzed with a low, constant hum. I knew the regular drivers by sight, and they knew me. It was a mundane, predictable end to my day, a necessary transition from the quiet order of the library to the quiet solitude of my apartment. On this particular night, a Tuesday in late October, the bus was even emptier than usual. Aside from me, there was only one other passenger, a man in the very back, slumped against the window, his face obscured by the dim light in the angle. The driver was Frank, a gruff but kindly man in his late 50s, who always had a thermos of coffee by his side. The bus pulled away from the deserted terminal, the hydraulic hiss of the doors sealing us into our temporary, metallic cocoon. I settled into my usual seat, about a third of the way back on the left, pulling out my e-reader, ready for the familiar drone of the engine to lull me into a state of semi-awareness. About 15 minutes into the ride, just as we were leaving the more brightly lit downtown area and entering a stretch of highway flanked by industrial parks and dark, overgrown fields, I noticed something odd. Frank usually maintained a steady, almost robotic pace. Tonight, he was slowing down, not gradually, but with a series of gentle, almost imperceptible hesitations. I glanced up from my e-reader, noticing the passing streetlights seemed to stretch out longer between us. The bus was definitely moving slower than usual. I dismissed it as him being tired, perhaps a bit heavy-footed after a long shift. Nothing to worry about. But then, the bus started to weave. Not wildly, not as if Frank was drunk, but a subtle, almost rhythmic sway, a gentle drift from the center of the lane towards the shoulder, then back again. My stomach made a small flip. I peered up at the rearview mirror, trying to catch Frank's eyes, but his gaze was fixed straight ahead, his posture rigid. The only thing I could make out was the faint sheen of sweat on his brow in the dim light. The weaving continued, more pronounced now, like a boat caught in a gentle swell. The other passenger in the back remained slumped, oblivious. A knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. Something wasn't right. This wasn't Frank's usual driving. The bus continued to drift, the gentle weaving morphing into something more deliberate. We were definitely on the shoulder now, the tires humming a different tune on the rougher asphalt. I gripped the pole in front of me, my e-reader forgotten. Frank was driving slower and slower, the bus almost crawling. We passed a rusted, abandoned gas station, its sign flickering weakly, then a stretch of darkened woods. My stop was still at least 10 minutes away, deep in a residential area. This felt wrong. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get off the bus, but we were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dark trees and empty fields. Then, Frank did something that made my blood run cold. He brought the bus to a complete stop. Not at a bus stop, not at a red light, but in the absolute middle of nowhere, on the darkened shoulder of the highway. The engine idled, a low, guttural rumble that now sounded sinister. The fluorescent lights inside flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at Frank's reflection in the rearview mirror, but his face was still unreadable, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see out of the front window. The other passenger remained motionless in the back. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "Frank," I called out, my voice a shaky whisper. "Is everything okay?" He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. His hands were still on the steering wheel, knuckles white. He just stared. After another agonizing minute of absolute silence, broken only by the hum of the engine, the door hissed open. Not the passenger door, but the emergency exit at the very front, usually sealed shut. A gust of cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and exhaust fumes. I flinched, pulling back into my seat. Still Frank didn't move. Then, from outside, just beyond the open door, I heard it. A soft thump as something heavy landed on the first step of the bus. My eyes were wide with terror. I could see nothing in the darkness beyond the door, just the inky blackness. Another thump, closer this time. Then a third, and a fourth, each one closer than the last, ascending the steps with slow, deliberate weight. Whatever it was coming onto the bus. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, not wanting to see, but unable to tear my ears away from the terrifying progression of those heavy, rhythmic thumps. Thump. Thump. It was on the main floor now, moving slowly down the aisle towards the front. I was pressed against the window, trying to become invisible. I could hear it breathing now, a low, raspy intake of air, like someone struggling. It passed the driver's seat. Frank still didn't move. The faint glow from my e-reader, still on my lap, illuminated the aisle just enough for me to see the floor. And then I saw it. A shadow. A colossal, misshapen shadow that moved with an unnatural, halting gait. It wasn't human. It was too broad, too low to the ground, with limbs that seemed to contort and shift with each heavy step. It was dark, darker than the shadows, almost absorbing the light around it. The shadow moved past my row. I could feel the cold radiating from it, a palpable chill that seeped into my bones. It was just a few feet away. I could hear its ragged breathing directly above me, a hot, faded scent filling the air. I squeezed my eyes tighter, willing it to pass. The bus creaked under its weight, then it stopped. Directly behind my seat, my heart seized in my chest. I could feel its presence, a dense, suffocating weight pressing down on me. I heard a soft, wet slithering sound, as if something was dragging itself across the back of my seat. I imagined a monstrous hand reaching over my shoulder, claws descending. I couldn't take it anymore. A scream tore itself from my throat. I scrambled out of my seat, abandoning my e-reader, and lunged for the emergency exit lever above the back door. My fingers fumbled with it, my mind screaming. The heavy door hissed open. I didn't even look back. I threw myself out, landing hard on the shoulder of the highway, scraping my hands and knees. The cold night air hit me, a shock that jolted me into action. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just away from that bus, away from that thing. I ran for what felt like miles, my lungs burning, until I collapsed, gasping for air, in the ditch beside the highway. The bus was a distant speck now, its single taillight glowing faintly, then disappearing entirely around a bend. I waited there, shivering for what felt like an hour, before a passing semi-truck finally stopped. The driver, a kind, elderly man, was concerned by my disabled appearance. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. I just mumbled something about feeling sick and needing to get home. He drove me to the nearest town, where I managed to call a cab. I never took the express bus again. Even after I quit that job, I took a different route, a different bus. And sometimes, when I'm alone and it's late, I can still feel that cold presence behind my seat, hear that ragged breathing, and see that colossal shadow just before it stopped waiting. My daily commute to art school involved a 40-minute subway ride across the city. It was a chaotic but reliable routine, a constant backdrop of screeching metal, flashing lights, and the dense press of humanity. I usually took the Blue Line, which was the most direct route, and by 7:30 a.m. it was always packed with a colorful array of students, office workers, and early morning stragglers. I'd grab a window seat if I could, watching the city lights blur past as we plunged into the dark tunnels. It was a familiar, comforting rhythm, a time when I could clear my head and mentally sketch out my day's projects. One particularly gray, drizzly morning in late spring, the subway felt different. The air in the car was heavy, thick with an almost metallic scent, and the usual chatter of commuters seemed muted, replaced by a low, almost subliminal hum that vibrated through the floor. I managed to snag a seat by the window, pulling out my sketchbook, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. The car was mostly full, but everyone seemed unusually quiet, their faces drawn and shadowed by the dim, flickering fluorescent lights. The train pulled out of my station, its doors hissing shut with a heavy finality. As the train rattled deeper into the tunnels, speeding past the blur of emergency lights and graffiti-scarred walls, I noticed the interior lighting start to dim even further. It wasn't a flicker. It was a slow, deliberate fade. as if the power was being carefully siphoned away. The low hum intensified, taking on a subtle, high-pitched whine that seemed to burrow into my ears. The other passengers, who had been quiet, now seemed almost unnaturally still, their eyes fixed straight ahead, unblinking. I tried to catch someone's gaze to share an unspoken concern, but no one responded. It was as if they were all frozen, caught in some strange, shared trance. The train then made an unscheduled stop. We were deep in the tunnel, miles from any station. The lights in the car went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness, broken only by the faint red glow of the emergency brake handles. The high-pitched whine of the train's internal systems died, replaced by an unsettling, absolute silence. Not even the distant rumble of another train, just the drip of water somewhere in the tunnel. My heart began to pound. What was happening? Why had we stopped? And why was everyone else so utterly silent, so still in the darkness? "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the sudden void. "Is anyone there? What's going on?" No one answered. No one stirred. Not a single cough, a single shuffle. The silence was absolute. I fumbled for my phone, trying to use the flashlight, but my hands were shaking too badly. I could feel the cold, clammy air of the tunnel seeping into the car, carrying a faint, earthy scent. The terror was starting to set in. We were trapped. Then, from somewhere in the darkness of the car, I heard it. A soft, wet slurp. It sounded sickeningly close, like someone slowly, deliberately sucking on something wet and fleshy. My blood ran cold. My imagination immediately conjured up grotesque images in the blackness. Another slurp, louder this time, followed by a faint, wet smack. It was coming from the back of the car, slowly, methodically moving forward. I pressed myself against the window, trying to melt into the cold glass, my eyes wide with terror, straining to see anything in the oppressive dark. The slurping sounds continued, accompanied now by a faint, rhythmic squelching, like something heavy and wet being dragged across the floor. It was getting closer. I could feel the vibrations through the seat. The air grew heavy with a cloying, metallic smell like old blood and damp earth. I squeezed my eyes shut, wishing I could disappear. My phone finally flickered to life, its weak flashlight beam cutting a small, trembling circle in the suffocating darkness. I didn't dare shine it towards the sound. I aimed it at my feet, trying to ground myself in reality, to remind myself I was still on a train. The slurping and squelching stopped, directly in front of my seat. The metallic smell intensified, making my stomach churn. I could hear something breathing a shallow, rapid intake of air directly beside me. Then a low, guttural gurgle, like someone trying to speak through a throat full of fluid. My eyes flew open, despite my will. The small beam of my phone's flashlight, aimed at the floor, cast a faint glow up into the space beside me. And there, standing in the aisle, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its head almost scraping the low ceiling of the subway car. Its limbs were unnaturally elongated and thin, almost skeletal, but covered in something dark and glistening, like wet leather. Its head was small, oddly shaped, and featureless, except for two large, black, unblinking eyes that reflected the faint light of my phone like polished obsidian. It was hunched over, its face less than a foot from my own, its breathing ragged and wet. And in one of its impossibly long, spindly hands it held something. A small, human bone, still glistening with something wet and red. It was slowly, methodically slurping on it. A guttural scream tore from my throat. I recoiled, kicking out, my foot connecting with something soft and yielding. The creature didn't flinch. Its head tilted slightly, those black eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. I scrambled over the seats, abandoning my phone, crawling desperately towards the emergency door release at the end of the car. My fingers fumbled with the cold metal lever, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doors hissed open, revealing the absolute blackness of the tunnel. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself out, landing hard on the gravel between the tracks, scrambling to my feet. I didn't look back, I just ran. Ran down the dark, echoing tunnel, the sounds of my own frantic footsteps and ragged breathing amplified in the enclosed space. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the train starting up behind me, then the screech of metal as it slowly began to move. I didn't stop, didn't dare to. I ran until I saw the emergency lights of the next station, a beacon in the terrifying darkness. I burst onto the platform, gasping for air, collapsing onto the grimy concrete. A few bewildered passengers stared at me, but I couldn't speak, couldn't explain. The subway doors opened, and a regular train pulled into the station. I never took the subway again. I walked, I took cabs, I even rode a bicycle, but I never went back into those tunnels. And to this day, when I hear a sudden, high-pitched whine or a wet, sickening slurp, I'm transported back to that dark, silent subway car, to the unblinking black eyes, and the metallic smell of something utterly monstrous. I've always been a creature of habit, especially when it came to my evening routine after my shift at the local grocery store. It was always the same: clock out at 9 p.m., walk 3 blocks to the corner of Maple and Elm, and wait for the number 7 bus. It was a well-lit stop, usually with a few other commuters, and the bus was reliable, arriving within minutes. The ride itself was only about 15 minutes to my apartment complex. It was a quiet, unassuming part of town, and I'd never felt unsafe, even walking home alone in the dark. This particular night, however, felt different from the moment I stepped out of the store. A thick, unsettling fog had rolled in, clinging to the streetlights and blurring the familiar outlines of the buildings. It was a dense, almost tangible mist, muffling sounds and reducing visibility to mere yards. The air was heavy, damp, and strangely still. I pulled my jacket tighter, quickening my pace towards the bus stop, a faint prickle of unease starting to form in the back of my mind. The bus stop, usually bustling, was completely deserted. The neon sign of the diner across the street was just a hazy glow. I checked my watch, 9:05 p.m. The bus should be here any minute. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through social media, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of isolation. The fog seemed to press in closer, swallowing the distant city sounds. My only companion was the faint, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation from the bus shelter's roof. I glanced up the street, hoping to see the familiar headlights of the number 7 cutting through the mist. But there was nothing, just an endless, swirling white. Then, through the fog, a shape began to materialize at the very edge of my vision. It was indistinct at first, just a darker patch in the swirling mist, about 20 feet away, on the opposite side of the street. As it drew closer, it resolved into a figure. A person, standing completely still, facing me. My heart gave a little jump. I hadn't heard anyone approach. The figure was tall and thin, shrouded in what looked like a long, dark coat. Its face was obscured by the fog and the distance, a featureless blur. It just stood there unmoving, watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was just another commuter waiting for a different bus, or someone going to the diner. But the way it stood, utterly still, facing me, felt wrong. I pretended to be absorbed in my phone, casting quick, furtive glances at the figure. It hadn't moved. It was just standing there, a silent sentinel in the fog. The bus was late, unusually late. My unease intensified into genuine alarm. I felt an undeniable prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being intensely scrutinized. The figure slowly, almost imperceptibly, started to move. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. A smooth, unnatural motion, as if its feet weren't touching the ground. It crossed the street without a sound, making directly for my bus stop. My breath hitched in my throat. It was still too far for me to make out any features, but the sheer unnaturalness of its movement, combined with its unblinking stare, filled me with dread. I clutched my phone, my thumb hovering over the emergency call button. This wasn't right. This wasn't human. It stopped directly across the street from the bus stop, no more than 10 feet away. The fog swirled around it, making it seem to waver at the edges. I could see more detail now. The coat was old, frayed, and seemed to absorb all light, making it impossibly dark. And its face, it wasn't a face. It was just a smooth, pale expanse, like stretched skin over bone, with 2 dark, empty hollows where eyes should be. No nose, no mouth. Just 2 black, abyssal pits where its gaze should have been. But I felt its stare, a cold, penetrating sensation that burrowed into my very soul. And then, I heard it. A faint, almost inaudible whimper, a sound of profound sorrow and desperate pleading emanating from the featureless face. My blood ran cold. The whimpering was so faint, so broken it was barely there, but it filled the silence, piercing the thick fog with its raw despair. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and morbid fascination. The bus was still nowhere in sight. I was utterly alone with this thing. The whimpering continued, rising and falling like a ghost's lament, and with each sound, the fog seemed to grow thicker around us, isolating us further from the world. I could feel the cold radiating from it, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. Then it raised a hand, slowly. Its arm was impossibly long, the fingers thin and skeletal, ending in long, dark nails. It pointed. Not at me, but down the street, in the direction the bus would come from. And the whimpering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural gasp, as if it was choking on air. I stared at its outstretched finger, then at the empty road. No bus. Nothing. But the gesture was clear. It wanted me to go that way. Towards the unknown, into the deeper fog. A sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline coursed through me. I didn't care what it wanted. I just knew I had to get away. I broke free from my paralysis, turning and running in the opposite direction, back towards the brightly lit grocery store. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I ran blindly through the dense fog, my heart pounding, the sound of my own ragged breath filling my ears. The whimper seemed to follow me, a fading, sorrowful echo in the mist. I didn't stop until I burst through the automatic doors of the grocery store, gasping for air, collapsing against a startled night shift worker. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't form. I just pointed frantically back into the fog-shrouded street. The worker, a young kid named Mark, looked at me with confusion, then concern. He walked to the door, peering out into the thick white. "There's nothing out there, man," he said, turning back to me. "Just fog." I knew he was right. I knew no one would believe me. I called a cab, refusing to walk home. I quit that job the next day. I still take the bus sometimes, but I never wait alone at a bus stop when the fog rolls in. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, and the air is thick with mist, I swear I can still hear that faint, sorrowful whimper, a lost and pleading sound from a featureless face in the fog, always just beyond the edge of vision.